Hi, everyone. My name is Yogesh Chavda. I'm the founder of Y2S Consulting. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am absolutely delighted to have Kyler Cheatham here today with me. I came across her by accident, actually, on TikTok. She showed up on my for you page, and I started following her. And got some incredible content that she's talking about. So, Kyler, thank you so much for joining me on this podcast today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm really grateful to be here.
Fantastic. So, just before we get started, usually what I like to do is have everybody, kind of like introduce themselves versus me doing the introduction for them. So, just tell us a little bit about who you are, what's your background, and how have you ended up in where you are right now?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm Kyler Cheatham. I am a business systems expert. I own a couple of companies, The Confluential, which we focus in really complex environment system architecture and implementation, and then Bite Size, which is a technical marketing company that helps our clients explain very complex technology to the average consumer. I'm super passionate about bringing kind of an air of transparency in big tech is really
Mhm.
what my platform is built around. I'm also a proud mom to two kids, a 5 and a 6 year old, and very passionate about the Colorado outdoors where we live.
Amazing, amazing. Well, I'm on the other end of the spectrum. My kiddo's now gone off to college, so we're officially empty nesters. So it's a different experience altogether, I
Yes.
must say.
Yeah,
So
different season of life. I'm sure that comes with its own very real challenges, but excitement as well.
absolutely, absolutely. So, thank you so much again for being here. So, I wanted, you've talked about two very big, meaty topics, right? So, I would love to get into them because, uh, you know, the degree of complexity with all the technology that's out there today, it can be overwhelming for anybody, even experts for that matter.
Mhm.
So, I would love to hear your thoughts in terms of, how are you tackling that, because you must be seeing this day in and day out from people. So I'd love to hear, what is it that how do you approach that with people who are like feeling overwhelmed initially?
Well, I mean, that's very valid, right? It is an overwhelming marketplace, especially in trying to figure out what is the best fit for your business or your goals. And also trying to swim upstream with that $1 billion big software marketing machine to make you think that this is just really easy and
Mhm.
it's a plug and play, like you turn on your microwave. So I think it's, certainly a valid concern when it comes to over innovation.
Mhm.
But it really comes back to the basics of good business strategy and good technical leadership, is remembering what problem are you trying to solve for your end users and why, and
Yeah.
just seeing, very clearly the agendas of everybody else involved in that conversation, really staying true to your goals.
Right. So I already see a big disconnect that happens. I was actually in a conversation with a couple of people this morning about this as well, where you have the business leaders who see all these bright, shiny objects, if you want to call it that, right? AI and generative AI and all that kind of stuff. And then you have the technical leaders who think more about the models and the technology aspects of it. And there's a bit of a chasm there between the two, I would imagine. Do you deal with that as well? I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, usually our clients are, bigger industries, over $1 billion type of things. And so
Okay.
when we have those bigger technical projects, there are certainly at the executive level a lot of different dynamics. Whether you have, an AI obsessed CEO and you have a CTO or CIO that's trying to really manage that expectations on what their business is capable of with the infrastructure that they have.
Mhm.
But that alignment and really, get overing that in the boardroom is really, really critical in order to be successful in any way, shape, or form.
Right. And I would imagine that takes time to get alignment as well, right? Or is that something that happens somewhat? or relatively quickly? I'm curious to hear your
Well,
thoughts.
I mean, it totally depends on who you're dealing with.
Of
In
course.
my opinion, obviously, I can be a straight shooter. Is that the more time we waste on things like egos and conversations at the executive team, if you're not aligned on what you're trying to do with this bigger technical project, then you have no business doing it. And you really need to take a step back and being like, if our executive team can't align on business goals, then how would we ever have the expectation for our technical or business teams to be able to implement that technology? And so a
Right.
lot of times that's where projects need to absolutely start, is to secure that alignment. A lot of people misunderstand alignment when it comes to the executive team as a destination, when it's absolutely not just one thing that you secure at the beginning of the project and then
Mhm.
you never talk about again. It has to be a continuation of securing that alignment throughout the project, or else we start to hear those really pesky objections of, why are we doing this again?
Mhm.
Because they often have been pulled in different areas or priorities, especially if they're not technical leaders.
Right. So, for people who are listening in on this, because I know there are people who, um, in the market research world specifically, I've been talking to a number of companies in the last several weeks where they're just starting their journey, and the CEOs of the
Mhm.
companies, or they're looking at this stuff and they're trying to figure out, a, is it right for my company? Number one,
Mhm.
does it actually impact or change the value prop that I'm offering in a good or bad way? And number three, if I wanted to do something, how do I even, I don't want to say start, but how do I
Mhm.
build out that roadmap that says this is what will get me to the kinds of outcomes that would be beneficial for my company? Um, what would you advise people who are at that inflection point, if you want to call it that?
Yeah, I mean, I would certainly advise them to stay grounded in their strategies,
Hmm.
right? We don't buy the technology and then build business strategies around the technology, right?
Right.
That's backwards. We build the business strategy and then find technology that can support that. I think when you're starting to build out your roadmap, there's a few critical pieces that you need to understand. One, your business goals, right? And that has nothing to do with technology, and it has everything to do with what are you trying to achieve as a business, right? And then second comes from understanding the complexity of larger enterprise software and navigating the different agendas that are involved in that. You have the vendor, right, whose job is to sell you software. They're going to sell you software no matter what your ecosystem is. That is their job, right?
Hmm.
And then you have the system integrator that's supposed to give you the technical requirements for these types of implementations. But that's all that their job is. Do they care if it works for you and optimized in your environment? Not really, right? They're going to go on to their next implementation because that's their job. Are these terrible people? Absolutely not, right? But
Yeah.
it's important to understand everybody's job, or we get this misalignment of expectations. So when you're building out that roadmap and you're starting to have these conversations with the vendor, you need to remember that they have an agenda, and it's not what's best for your business in that.
Mhm.
Might it be a good fit? Absolutely. That might be great. And then you might have a great vendor partnership, as you should have. But you
Mhm.
have to remember that the ownership still lies with you. Business problem, technology, and then most importantly, figuring out if your ecosystem or your culture is even able and has the capacity to implement something in that way. And a lot of people miss that step. And that's where we get the most expensive part of these types of implementations, which is redoing them or redesigning them or re implementing them, and really understanding the cost around that.
Yeah. So, I'm curious because there are two parts to that. I think, right, this process that you have internally within the company, and then you have the people and their, I call it tribal knowledge,
Yeah.
that's ingrained there, right? And you're tapping into both those things at the end of the day, right? In terms of the implementation part, do you get involved in that, or is that part of your offering as well, or?
Oh, most certainly. Yeah. So a
Yeah.
lot of that will start is especially in the executive coaching session with those, really understanding what the CIO is looking for, making sure that the leadership team is ready to go, because that has to be the first step in
Mm.
building out that roadmap, or their technical teams are going to be all misaligned because they're misaligned. It's, not
Yeah.
really rocket science in that situation. And then, we've got to assess the organization. A lot of people want to skip that part. And that's a critical piece of coming in and understanding how your people feel about it. And honestly, my favorite meetings to be in are when we read out those or those organizational assessments to the executive team, and they are shocked because they thought, their team was so ready for this, had no idea that they didn't trust them to implement this because 5 years ago they tried to implement something and failed. That doesn't go away.
Mm.
So that is a critical piece and a critical data point, as is tribal knowledge. A lot of people say, oh, well, Jim from production is going to be a huge hurdle to this because he's been doing the same exact process for 30 years and he doesn't like technology. And it's like, okay, well, Jim is a walking, talking data set. And for
Yeah.
you to treat him
Yeah.
like he is some sort of weird roadblock to this, that's just bad leadership, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
You have to make sure that you're able to make him comfortable and extract him. Nothing drives me more crazy than hearing, well, we're just going to, reallocate him to a strategic role. It's like, oh, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Right. Like
Yeah.
we have no idea what that means. Neither's just Jim. So he's going to fill in the blanks all of a sudden. And that's when we start this storytelling rumor mill that is very expensive and dangerous
Mm.
to the organization. So that's, a critical piece of our overall methodology and approach.
Wow, you're talking about stuff that is so like relevant to me in my world right now as well. So, um, would it be possible for you to like mask this? Obviously, you can't mention names and stuff like that, but more could you give us some examples of how you've tackled those situations and that have led to either positive outcomes or like the outcome that you just described, where it's saying it generates this whole storytelling rumor mill, which is not really helpful to the organization. But what steps did you take to avoid that situation or to actually make the situation better and more manageable?
Yeah, well, we definitely get a front row seat to this because usually you don't call, the independent consultants until you're in trouble, until you're
Yeah.
like, oh man, I am fighting with my vendor, my people hate me, that we're not on timeline, and then they call us to say, hey, what's wrong with this? So a
Hmm.
lot of times we get that front row seat into what can go wrong
Yeah.
if you don't take, that planning approach and really listen to your end user group.
Hmm.
So we had a client that had already chosen a new ERP system. That happens a lot. We come in, they've already chosen their system. However, when we came in to really assess what they're doing, they're starting in an area of organization and implementing it in a department that's not really relevant to the problem they're experiencing. They're on, 30-year-old green screen system that
Oh.
is critically flawed in the
Mm.
fact that their production could go down at any minute and there's
Mm.
no scenario to back it up. Very complex manufacturing type of ecosystem, huge risk to the business, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
why did we start our implementation in the accounting department that has nothing to do with the critical errors of this type of production, when your production team has been over here like, hey man, this is hanging by a thread of hopes and dreams, this is risky, this is stressing me out. And
Mm.
the executive team was like, well, we thought we would start in a low risk environment. And we're like, well, what you basically said to those employees was, I don't really care that you're experiencing this and you didn't have that intention, right? But
Yeah.
because that wasn't communicated effectively, you're going to now have to backtrack and redo a lot of different things. Oh, and by the way, this is not a great fit for you and
Yeah.
your environment, but you were sold it on some golf course somewhere. And you have to remember, that there's an over $1 billion big software marketing machine that is, again, trying to sell you these types of solutions that are going to be some silver bullet to your organization, especially with the rise of the AI hype.
Yeah.
And that's just not the case. And if we're not understanding the end user requirements, or where there's a critical issue in the end user experience, then that's something that we now need to backtrack and redesign, and gain mind share with that department that is really, really struggling at this point.
Hmm.
We're going to have to go back and rebuild that trust, and that's not easy to do, right?
No, no, not at all. Yeah. So you touched on something that I was maybe I was thinking about this the wrong way. So now you're actually helping me and also learn in the process. Um, I understand why leaders would say, let's start in a low risk environment. Let's do a bit of a proof of
Mhm,
concept, do some pilot work, and then scale it. Right? That's kind of
mhm,
like the mentality people come in with
mhm,
primarily. And I will admit I say the same thing too. um, and you don't want to obviously compromise your core systems up front, because if
mhm,
that goes down, the whole company crashes at the end of the day, right? So
mhm,
how do you determine where to start in that scenario, and how do you decide, should we start with the high risk things, or should we
mhm,
start with where the biggest pain points are, and just tackle it
mhm.
and embrace the risk that comes with it, or how do you navigate that, I guess, is the question.
Yeah, so that would come in a risk analysis, right? Like,
Yeah,
every organization is going to be different when
yeah.
it comes to what are they implementing, what are the
Mhm.
risks, what is the scenario and a potential profit loss associated with that. And so that's a critical piece, in that planning phase, to go through what is my risk portfolio and what is my risk analysis, so you can choose. What we're trying to pilot this new, more maverick AI system. We're going to start in sales because
Yeah,
that is a low risk environment for this. We're going to
yeah,
pilot it there. We're going to take these key learnings and scale it to the next, and to the next user group or department or whatever.
yeah,
In some scenarios, right, the risk of completely shutting down your production line is much higher than potentially, losing mind share with a certain department. In those scenarios, then you're going to have to pick and choose, what is going to be critical to that. And your vendor's not going to help you do that, right? They don't really care where you start and implement, as long as you've signed the contract and you're paying those licenses immediately from them. You've already bought it from them. So they're not going to really, especially certain vendors that, use more of a VAR network.
yeah,
They're not really going to jump in here and be like, hey, let me help you decide how to implement this. And then the system integrator, same thing, right? Their job is technical requirements. You tell them where to start, they're going in there where to start, right? They're not a strategic partner that's like, hey, maybe you shouldn't start there because the bigger business, you're the business owner, right? That's why when
mhm.
we start to do things like outsource implementations because they're hard, right? Then we start to give the keys to our business to somebody else. And that's the biggest risk of all, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So there's a leadership aspect to this. Number one, there is
Mhm.
a call it a technical understanding that the leaders need to have of
Mhm.
how to do the risk assessment, and understanding where to start, right? Or they have to make a decision on where to start, but they have to at least understand what that risk reward looks
Mhm.
like, and whether those teams actually have the capacity to take that on alongside trying to keep the lights on at the same time. There's a lot of moving parts here, right? So that's a complexity in its own right as well, I would imagine.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's very complex. That's why people, and we see industry analysts, even if they're biased in this
Mm.
this overall data point, but we see those 60 to 80% of transformations fail because nobody's we our goal, right, is to implement an ERP system once in a
Yeah,
business, right?
yeah,
We're not doing that every other year, so it's not like a competency that a lot of people have in house. And
mm,
for business leaders, it's not easy. You got a lot of things going against you to try and pull you in the wrong direction. I always say the SaaS mafia, right? They're trying to pull you in and really charge you money. That's what their business model is. And
right.
you have to be vigilant in making sure that you don't sign a 5-year contract for a system that you're not going to be able to get out of.
Yeah. So it's interesting you say that, because I actually lived an experience where there was a system change being done, and oh my gosh, like the world completely crashed
Yes.
around
Yes.
us, right? So I've been through that experience once, and it wasn't pleasant to say the least, right? Um, what in your experience, when you look back at those situations where where things did not work out, and those low ROI as a consequence, we're seeing, sorry, I'm connecting a couple of dots here. Like MIT came out with a study recently saying that 95% of projects in AI fail or don't have ROI. But then Google came out and said 88% of their projects are actually being successful. So
I'm sure they did. Yeah.
there, of course they did, right? So there's a lot of that mixed messaging going on. It's confusing for people, quite frankly
Mhm.
speaking. So how, in your world, how do you help people? Um, and maybe I'm belaboring the point here, but like, how do you reassure people to say that, okay, there is a pathway here, but these are the kinds of puts and calls you have
Mhm.
to take that'll get you to a successful outcome?
Yeah, and I think the first piece that you hit on is any sort of large enterprise technology implementation is
Yeah,
hard. It
yeah,
is a grind on your people. I have never in my entire career walked into a room of people being like, "Yes, an ERP implementation. I cannot wait. I'm so pumped." Nobody says that, right?
yeah,
Because they're
exactly.
very difficult, they're complex, and
Mm.
there's a lot of really just, very fluid moving parts.
Yeah, yeah,
Accounting wants this thing, sales wants this thing,
mm,
production wants this thing. The
yeah,
project manager is trying to, make sure they understand the technical requirements. IT saying, no, we can't do that. There's a lot of people
mhm,
involved in these types of projects. And if you have a weak or, completely missing leadership tier, that can be very, very challenging and hard for the team going through it, right?
yeah, yeah,
So
yeah,
I think that's the first piece that we always have in these conversations is just a little bit of coming to Jesus and being like, hey, this is going to be a difficult thing, whether you outsource it or you don't, right?
mhm,
Does it
mhm,
have to be painful? Absolutely not. But you do have to know that you can't ask your implementation core team to, implement a new MES, QMS, warehouse management system, anything, and then also do their day job. That's
yeah,
not possible for them.
yeah,
So you, as the leadership team, are in charge of supporting them and figuring out how you're going to backfill their positions, how you're going to make sure that morale is high in these types of situations where they run into a snag and they're not all quitting because they hate it here and you're working them 60 hours a week and
yeah,
it's just this absolute mess. So the leadership team has to be tight lockstep and really understanding what that's going to look like for them. If
yeah,
you had a vendor that came in and was like, it's really not that much work, maybe like 5 hours a month, blah, 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 you should run far away from that vendor because they're never going to tell you like this is going to be super hard, but they should be giving you relatively clear expectations of
mhm,
what it takes to implement a system of this magnitude or of this size. So
yeah,
that's the first part, is really understanding that. The second part of the conversation is a lot of times they'll want to come in and be like, I think we should go with IFS. I think we should go with SAP. I think we should go with Oracle. I think we should go with D365. I think we should do all of these things. And we're like, well, we're not going to talk about technology for at least probably our first three calls, right?
yeah,
Because we need to figure out, why do you want to go with IFS? What
mhm,
do you want to solve? What is the issue? And then also, have you made up that issue in your mind? Or is that actually what the end users are experiencing? I would say 8 times out of 10, when we speak to the end users, they're like, yeah, I don't even do that. Right. So then we see a big misalignment there
mm.
around what problem we're trying to solve. That needs to be the first piece that's in line before we even start to talk about, what sort of drones or robots are going to be running around our production floor. Right.
I, I I can completely relate to that because I was in a conversation where I asked the question, about what problem are you trying to solve for? I wanted to kind of like get that team to like one area, right? And it was fascinating to see the response. Like, we want to improve speed was the answer I got. And I said, okay, that's fair. That's totally legitimate. But is that really the problem? Like how much of a speed improvement would you consider to be successful, right? And they gave me an answer which, at first pass I would say, yeah, that's reasonable. Like, 20,
Mhm.
30% increase in speed, that's not a bad thing. But then when you look at some of the transformational things that are happening because of AI tools, where you could reduce by 80%, I'm sitting there thinking like, is 20% good enough then, kind of thing,
Yeah.
right? And do you face that at all? And how do you help or coach or guide people through those kinds of conversations?
Yeah. I mean, I would say more in that conversation, it's why do you want to speed up production? Because you're not meeting customer needs,
Mhm.
because your team is too bloated and you don't have the budget. Like what is the issue there? It doesn't
Yeah,
really matter if we're going to speed it up by 20%, 30%, 90%, right? Why do you want to speed it up
yeah,
before we kind of start to do this? So a lot of them are just kind of peeling back that onion, and seeing like what they're really needing in that type of
yeah,
environment. And then also, I mean, I find, and I don't know if you find the same thing, they struggle with what the cost of it is. That's
yeah.
the one thing that I would say is the biggest barrier, is
Mhm.
they think it's going to cost this much, and it's not. It's not going to even come close to costing that much. It's that is the licensing fees. You need to add at least 20%, to what you think it's going to cost, because there's going to be so many things that come up. Just
Yeah,
because you have an additional 20% bubble doesn't mean you need to spend it, right? That comes down
yeah,
to discipline,
yeah.
when it's project management. But that's just been, my experience with that.
I get that. So, I'm with you on peeling back the onion kind of thing, and obviously I can't talk too much about some of the stuff, but um, my sense of it is that it's always going to come back down to money, right? Are you going to be
Oh, yeah.
making more money, or are you going to be driving more revenue? And is this going to give you an opportunity to, um, you know, uh, communicate externally that I can do this better, faster, cheaper, whatever the case
Mhm.
may be, kind of thing, right? But what I also see in these conversations is that there's a lot of hesitation that I can do all this work and I still may not get me what I want.
Mhm.
And I just wonder like how that how to overcome those kinds of objections and barriers, because they're legitimate, of course, but it's hard to overcome them.
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes down to prioritization. Not
Yeah,
everyone's going to get exactly what they want, especially out of an enterprise level system, right?
yeah,
Or a technology implementation. Again, we have all of these completing agendas and priorities. And that's why it's so critical it's not so much about getting what we want, right? It's about what does the service to the end user need to be.
yeah,
And if we don't have those conversations with the end users, then we
mm,
don't really understand what the experience looks like. And a lot of times in those kind of focused user groups,
yeah,
a lot of times they're not realizing what their colleagues are doing across the table, or what they're experiencing.
yeah,
So it can be a very healthy conversation to be like, well, I want to be 30% faster because it takes me 2 weeks to produce all of these different things. And
mm,
accounting's all of a sudden has this light bulb of, well, no wonder it costs so much. I had no idea it took 2 weeks to, produce this type of thing. And so that actually makes a lot of sense for prioritization, because if we can make them faster, then my job will thus become easier because they're faster,
yeah.
right? And that piece of it, really understanding what different user groups are going through, but we're never going to know that if we don't talk to the users.
Yeah, and it's crazy because how often does that happen actually?
Oh, yeah, all the time, all the time. And my favorite, again, are those process workshops where you
Mm,
have, the production manager over here being like, well, we do X, Y, and Z for process. And then
yeah.
you bring out the people that actually execute those processes. And they're like, we haven't done that in 20 years.
Oh
And
my
the production manager is like, what? You don't do that? And they're like, well, no, we can't, because we don't have, whatever resource they might need to
God.
utilize that. And all of a sudden, we were about to build a whole technology system around a process that didn't exist.
Oh my gosh, that's crazy. That's absolutely crazy. Wow. I love this conversation because you're highlighting all the kinds of issues that even service companies that have their own internal systems and processes
Mhm.
sometimes don't realize what it takes to actually keep it moving forward. And it just makes me wonder how some of these companies actually survive. I really question that at
Oh,
some
yeah.
you know So with all this AI stuff that's going on, you're obviously dealing with that. I know you're talking about this a lot too.
Mhm,
How you know, I have this hypothesis or way of communicating, and you can please correct me if you think
mhm,
I'm miscommunicating this from a basic perspective. I see a lot of companies trying to take AI tools and they try to bolt it onto their existing
mhm,
processes. And I'm saying, yeah, that's going to give you some, efficiencies over time, but that's not really the true value add of,
mhm,
using AI tools. What I'm saying to companies is that you want to rethink the entire workflow process and make AI the center of your workflow, and then you build new processes with AI being in the center of everything, basically.
mhm.
Um, am I talking about this the right way? What's your reactions to what I just said?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of people try and over new technology, whether it be AI or anything like that,
Yeah,
over an existing architecture that
yeah,
can't consume that. It doesn't have the capability.
yeah,
So then we start bending tools until they break, right? And that's where we get in trouble because we're
yeah,
not using the technology for what it was created and coded for. And so that's when, we have a leader that's obsessed with AI, and all of a sudden he's like, what are we doing with AI? What are we doing with AI? Because the board is chirping in his ear being like, what are we doing with AI? What are we doing with AI?
yeah,
And then all of a sudden it comes down to the team and they're rushing around. We're not solving a problem. We're just trying to find AI and trying to attach it to everything that we do. But
yeah,
nobody stopped to say, like, hold on, what is the business value out of putting, this
yeah,
AI tool on this type of thing? And what's the risk for that? I think a lot of people miss that,
yeah.
especially when you're using third party AI applications. There is an opening there for risk for your data for a lot of different pieces
Yeah.
that you're not considering. And that piece of it is something that I've seen a lot of companies get in a lot of trouble for because they can't secure that type of information. It becomes a huge risk for them.
So there are a couple of threads here we can go down into different rabbit holes, but from that risk assessment perspective, I see companies talking a lot about we can't have our proprietary data come onto your servers and
Mhm.
systems, because that's there's a risk there,
Yeah.
APIs and all that kind of stuff, right? So they're saying, okay, can you build that on our
Mhm.
systems, and so that it stays within our own closed ecosystem, which intuitively makes sense. But then the question becomes, does your team have the skill set to build that, or do you need somebody to help you build that? How do you manage it and keep it maintained and all that kind of stuff that comes along with that? So that's one pathway that I
Mhm.
see, conversations that I see. The other one I see is I love the terminology used around like bending technology till it
Mhm.
breaks. I called it replace versus reshape
Mhm. Yeah.
as a way to kind of like manage that part of the conversation. I'll leave it up to you. Which pathway do you want to talk first?
I can pick up on the first. We'll just go,
Yeah,
in that type of order.
yeah,
I think there's a misunderstanding out there. We definitely encourage clients to build their own AI. And a
right,
lot of times in those conversations, they're like, well, we can't, we know you're building this for us, but we can't give you like our data. And we're over here like, we don't want your data. We don't want anything
exactly.
about that, right? We want to teach you how to be able to build within your environment. So one, it becomes, a capital expenditure. It becomes something that you can potentially have as intellectual property. And it's not something that you built with a vendor and they're immediately going to go sell to your competitor,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And so that's what we encourage. I think there's a difference between, open AI platforms and building on AI platforms. You can build on that without the internal competencies in the house. We see that all the time,
Yeah.
right? We build it for you. And then your team of probably very, very well talented IT professionals, they can certainly do this in an LLM format, right? And that piece of it is often just misunderstood. We have AI engineers that, graduated with AI engineering degrees because those were available at that time,
Yeah.
right? We don't have our software engineer, but if you were a software engineer, you can easily engineer AI, right? So it's
Yeah.
just about kind of skilling that. And our goal is not to be there forever. It's quite the contrary. Like, we'll help you build this, and then it is your tool, right? You're always welcome to contact us for help, or, if you want to develop a new piece of it in collaboration. But our mantra is, we're not going to sell you a, GPT wrapped platform.
Yeah.
That is what I see in the industry right now. I think it's absolutely crazy.
Mm.
And it's wrong, is really what it is, because clients don't, or businesses don't understand that
Mm.
that's what you're selling to them. And then all of a sudden it's putting the core business at risk,
Yeah.
because even OpenAI in their enterprise licenses or whatever else that they say, it's still an open platform, right?
Yeah.
That is bringing and scraping things off the internet. I mean, we just saw this in the news with Deloitte Australia, this week, that it's been, a huge embarrassment for them because they're utilizing those types of open AI platforms for client deliverables.
Yeah.
And that is just, something that completely lacks any sort of integrity.
Yeah, yeah. So I get that. So, and and linked with that also, I think companies sometimes um, don't offer all the capabilities, which also then limits internally. Like I've heard with like Copilot, for example,
Mhm.
some companies don't offer their employees access to agents, as an
Mhm.
example.
Mhm.
Do you come across that situation as well? Because there's the data protection, privacy, quality, all that stuff. That's
Mhm.
one part, but then accessibility to all the capabilities within the platform
Mhm.
itself becomes another part to it as well, I would imagine.
Absolutely. I mean, and that again comes down to the leadership. Do you understand what tool you're implementing? Do you understand that user access level? Do
Mm.
you understand the environment? Obviously, if you're in a Microsoft environment,
Yeah,
right? You cannot just bring in any sort of agent and plug it into a Microsoft system. Microsoft is going to block your data all day long because they don't want you to use that. They would like you to use Copilot. Same
yeah,
with any sort of SAP ecosystem, same with Oracle, right? It's the same way. So you really have to decide, like, are you going to build on Azure then at that point? Or like, what are you going to do?
yeah,
And no, there's no wrong answer to that. But in those types of situations, you've got to give your teams the resources that they need to be able to have that. I would say in bigger organizations, that needs to be an open feedback loop. Hey, I don't have access to this agentic tool that I need. I don't have access to this level of Copilot. How do they submit that and make sure that that's a continuous feedback loop and that you're listening to them,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
I hear you. Here's why you don't have access, right?
Mhm.
Here's why. Or, oh, that's a great point. Let me get you access by X, Y, and Z. If
Yeah,
that's not a continuous circle of communication, then
yeah.
innovation is completely broken.
So, so again, I'm asking for an opinion here now. Like, my suspicion is that even if you were to give access to 100% of the employee population, only 1 to 5% may actually use all the capabilities of those tools in the first place. 95% will probably not even be aware and don't even want to use those tools, like building out agents or creating agentic workflows. They may be users of that, but let somebody else go build it for me. I
Mhm.
don't have the wherewithal and the time or the capacity to do that. Am I
I
uh,
mean, I think you're right. I think it depends on the organization for
yeah,
sure. Like, what
yeah,
size are you? I
of
mean, if
course,
you're
yeah,
using, Copilot, I mean, likely you're a larger type of organization. But
yeah.
in those types of, I'm treating my employees as my, crowdfunding development team.
Mm.
I mean, that is ridiculous in the fact that, yes, there's a level of innovation where you could be saying, if you're interested in this, but you don't need to continue to pile on those types of jobs for them. Will
Yeah.
they use the tool? That depends if you explained it right. Right?
Mm.
If you
Mm.
didn't explain what would be in it for them to make their job more efficient,
Yeah.
then they're not going to want to use the tool whatsoever. It's not, change isn't something that people are like, yes, my job is changing today. I'm so excited, for X, Y, and Z. No, you have to show them why that tool is going to make their experience better.
So to that end, there's an education and upskilling
Yep.
part that comes with that, right? I think that's the second part of what you're offering as a when you kicked it off. Is that am I
We
accurate in
don't
saying
we
that?
don't typically no. So I mean, we could definitely advise on, the education front,
Yeah,
but all of that should be done, in our opinion, by the internal team. Or we often will bring in a learning management partner if it's like something that's a very high learning, higher education, things like that client
yeah,
that's really focused on that type of thing.
yeah.
But building out kind of like bite-sized on-demand learning, I think is something that should be internalized. Yeah, can you have associated with that? I think for bite size, we help with companies like system integrators, like new AI startups. We help them go into the marketplace with authenticity, as opposed to continuing to go in and being like, hey, this is going to change your life.
Yeah.
That type of marketing with the hype cycle that we're seeing with AI, people and consumers are starting to get wise to that. Right. So you need to be able to go to the
Mm.
marketplace, tell the truth about your tool, but again, explain to the consumer what's
Yeah.
in it for them, just like we have to do to the users.
Yeah. Well, in that space though, there is the experience piece that the consumer faces. Are they getting a better experience than what they were previously
Absolutely.
getting, right? That's like issue number one. And we've got some examples of that where things haven't worked out well. Taco Bell was one of those recent examples. In the drive-through, I think they were trying
Yeah.
to automate the process. It didn't work out too well. They, kudos to them for
Yeah.
owning it basically, right? And being willing to scale it back. But how do you help companies in that scenario of saying, okay, from a customer experience perspective, you're trying to integrate AI. It requires a lot of back end work to make the tool work effectively for you. Um, what are the steps that you advise people to go through in that situation?
Well, I think, the biggest piece of that is really, that user experience mapping. You have to know what the actual end user is supposed to experience, or, what that really looks like. What is the ease of use for them? Are there any pain points? That's part of just the overall testing and scenario based for these types of technology. And that's why, we always preach that they're not plug and play, right? Can you
Mhm.
implement them in one day? For sure. If you want them to not work well, like, absolutely, you can
Yeah.
do that. No question about it. But I think, unless you have a clear understanding of what that experience is going to look like for your end user, whether that's your customer or your employees, you really must understand the full picture involved in that.
I understand that completely. So we talked about the first part. The second part was reshape versus replace.
Yes.
That's the other part that I feel I find really fascinating in terms of how do you go through that decision making process and the risk assessment that comes along with it, and when do you actually do either of the two?
Mhm.
One's a high risk, high reward. The other one's low risk, potentially low reward kind of thing.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
I'm just curious as to what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, well, I think, the line of thinking is great in the fact that you're assessing your current ecosystem. A lot
Yeah,
of people don't even want to talk about their current ecosystem because they're like, we don't want that. We want, something new. And it's like, okay, again, why? We're peeling back the onion of like, why do you want something new? What are
yeah,
the pain points? Do you understand the full functionality of your current system?
mhm,
Do you understand what could potentially be added on to that through, a new modular or something like that?
yeah,
And so that piece of it is really, really a critical piece. Is it the most fun piece? Absolutely not. Just like assessing your data is not, the most fun thing in the world, but it's a critical active discipline for a highly technical company. You want to be
yeah,
an AI first company? Awesome. You better
yeah,
have really, really good data governance and master data management, right? You have that piece of it is not going to be that fun. Who's your data stewards? Who's your owner? Who's in
mhm,
charge of quality? All of those different people that don't really want to talk about those things. That's what we need to look at with the current software. And a lot of times when we come in, what is your issue with your current setup? Oh, I don't know, all of these different things. And a lot of times we come out saying, you don't need any new technology, right? You need to figure out how to utilize what you have. And
Yeah.
then you also need to be able to really understand what trying to problem you're trying to solve. Like if you don't like one dashboard, that's no reason to completely rip out a system. Or a
Mhm.
lot of times they're in a conflict with the vendor, and it can be, again, a misunderstanding of everybody's different roles.
Mhm.
So we come in, as much as people, obviously I'm very hard on software vendors because I think they should do better in a lot of different scenarios, but our job is to come in and see, can we repair that existing relationship with
Yeah.
the vendor, because it's going to be much more heartache and expense on the client to rip that out and
Mhm.
replace it with something. That doesn't mean we're not going to do that, but it certainly means we're going to be intentional and mindful
Yeah.
about that different system. I will say on the, bending it side, we see a lot of this with, SAP environments. They're, completely tumultuous in the fact that usually an average SAP user has over 300 different integrations. It's a massive mess under there usually,
Yeah.
especially when you're trying to rush through moving from ECC to S4HANA, and you're like, oh my gosh, I don't know how I'm going to do this. I've got 80 different plants worldwide. And the first thing to do is just calm down and remember that this is your environment, not SAP's environment. However, you do have a massive SAP system. The likelihood that you're going to rip that out is very, very low. And I
Mhm.
always say, I'm here for crazy. Like I'm here to do it. But you got to know that this is going to be a massive transition for your already very global complex business.
Yeah.
So if you're willing to do that and your teams are prepared for that, then by all means that's your right. But just know this is going to be a very difficult situation. So when we try and bend this technology with all of these customizations, custom integrations, custom everything, then that's where we get in this Frankenstein monster of a system that
Mhm.
wasn't ever intended to work in, the way that it's working now. And that is on, the client. Should the vendor have let them do that? No, but every customization they get is more money in their pocket, right? So you have to remember that it's not out of the goodness of their heart are they going to be like, hey, please don't do this customization that we can build for you. Oh, and lock you into a contract with us for the rest of your life,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Because we own your options are A, to break your system, critically break it, or
Mhm.
B, let us own it because we own the proprietary property to this custom integration. So there's a lot that goes into that. Should you never customize? No, but you need to know what you're getting into if you're going to start to play with changing a system that was not built that way.
Yeah. As you're saying that, I'm reflecting on, like, the market research industry and the vendors that play in this. They all talk about customization all the time. So we
Mhm.
do custom research, we do this. But the supply chain for delivery, from data collection to survey design to analysis, blah blah blah, is not that different at the end of the day.
No.
So there's not a lot of true customization in that sense. But it comes across as if they are. And I just wonder if if there were platforms that were available that would allow people to just be on that platform without the customization. Would that solve like 80% of their problems, quite frankly speaking?
I
So
mean, I think that's a lot of the open source business model. Like, right, that's what they're
yeah.
trying to do. The issue with open source is
Yeah.
it's a lot of management when you build a modular based system. Is that a bad thing? No. Is it super flexible and affordable? For sure. But you have
Yeah.
to remember that for every integration, you need someone that manages it. So
Exactly.
just, yeah, that's something, that's sold a lot in the marketplace, is like, this is an easy, this is the future of ERP, and maybe it is, right? But you have to know that takes an internal competency to manage a system like that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, completely. Completely. So I want to change gears for a bit, because we were like we were heavy, into this conversation. But I want to talk a little bit about you. You were named as a top fintech voice. Is that correct?
I was, yes.
Tell me about that.
I don't even know. No, so I mean, I am the founder of the business. So a lot of
Yeah.
times I am the face of the awards, and the awards are won by my teams. Excellent work. So
Yeah.
that's something that I always want to make critically clear, that it
Mm.
might be, my fancy headshot on that, but it's not at all just my work. So when it comes to the FinTech award, we won that with the Solaris Institute, which if you haven't heard of them, is an amazing payments consulting training institute. They saw like, hey, there's an area in consulting where nobody gets trained on except in industry.
Yeah.
We're going to offer that training. So what we did in collaboration with them was helped them to connect. When you have a payment technology, how do you ensure that it fits with the rest of the ecosystem of the environment? So that's kind of where that award came from, was really looking in financial technology and making sure that you can innovate even in that area, but it has to be done with the rest of the business in collaboration.
Of course, but first of all, congratulations for winning
Oh,
that.
thank you.
And fintech is an area that is so complex as well,
Yeah.
right?
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Like it's
Very,
hard,
very complex. Yes.
so to wrap your head around that is hard enough, so for you to kind of like in your team to be able to rise head and shoulders above everybody else, that's just amazing. So I'm just curious, like how did you end up in that space of all places, just out of curiosity?
I don't know. I kind of get pulled into spaces and then just land there. No, I think it's, I always say it's really on women that have
Mm.
pioneered that path before me,
Yeah.
that have really like sat in an industry that's typically very male dominated and said, I'm going to make a space here for
Yeah.
other people to learn and to
Mm.
add that inclusivity. And I, simply just joined to add value. And again, I'm not a perfect finance technology specialist. What we really need to do is listen to the business of what their financial needs are,
Yeah.
understand the compliance. I think a big part of these awards is our approach to the overall industry is a bit different. Consulting in general has been very competitive and
Yeah.
kind of cutthroat. We don't operate that way at all. If we don't have the internal capability, then we call, a trusted other consultancy that does that and brings them in. Because why would we try and reinvent the wheel
Mm.
when we know someone that's done it successfully?
Yeah.
That's our commitment to their clients. So a lot of these different awards and collaborations are because we've really reached out and unified a
Mm.
lot of consultancies in the industry, as opposed to try and do this weird like blacklisting thing.
I totally understand that. So you said something that I want to like just like tease out a bit, about women in this space in particular. And these are male dominated spaces. You're 100% right. So what counsel and advice would you give young women who are starting off their careers right now? In fact, I just talked to one woman yesterday. In fact, she was asking for some mentoring advice, and she was asking me, how do I get started? Like, where do I start it? Now, as a
Mhm.
male, I'm trying to offer what I know,
Oh
but
yeah.
what would be your counsel and advice to women? If they got a background in engineering, they're interested in supply chain, they're interested in marketing, they're interested in AI. There's a confluence of all those things going on right now.
Mhm.
So, what would be your suggestion for that?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, I think advocates, of any gender are very important. There's
Yeah,
lots of many of my male colleagues that have brought, and dropped down the ladder for many women in
yeah,
their space, or any minority in general. So that is very important.
yeah.
The number one thing I would say is we have so many great women in tech networks.
Hmm.
And joining those, they're free to join. Many of them, cost is usually a barrier, especially for our young professional networks, where
Yeah,
they can join these types of organizations and have a safe place to ask questions. A lot of
mm,
times people don't want to be like, hey, I'm kind of scared to go to my all male leadership team and present this. It makes me very nervous. Well, how can I prepare for something like that? And then
yeah,
they can do, mock presentations and, get questions and feedback before that. So they're able to prepare. I would say the one thing I always say to especially young women in tech is
Yeah.
make sure that you're documenting. A lot of times I even just did it, right? I'm not a, I'm embarrassed by winning those types of awards. It makes me uncomfortable. I want to make sure that my team is recognized. That it's a lot of documenting, just as you would a project manager, of what you have achieved in this area. And that's a big piece of it, not for your own clout or confidence building, right? But so that you can continue to build this repertoire of these are my skill sets.
Hmm.
I think really going through like a PMP or a project certification is really helpful to helping to have that disciplined organization of thoughts.
Yeah.
Is a good thing. PMPs can be expensive, so consider just getting a certificate. Google now has project management
Hmm.
certificates and those
Yeah.
types of things for a very, very nominal fee. Going through those types of pieces are critically important. And then I would say, using those digital networks like LinkedIn, reaching out and saying, hey, this is what I'm interested in. Would anyone be up for having a 15-minute conversation with me? Drop a link in there so people can book and go from there. And that piece will really help you decide of what discipline do you want to go into or focus your time on.
Amazing. So, one last question for you, because I know we're almost at time here. So, if there was one message you would give to, women in tech, and in terms of what they should either aspire for or what they should be building out as part of their skill sets, what would that be from your vantage point?
I would say my biggest piece of advice is to, really think through why you care, what people think of you. And obviously, someone who's very divisive in the industry and has lots of opinions. People have lots of opinions for me. And it took me a very long time to get confident enough in my own opinions to not care what anyone else thinks of me. Remember your mission, remember why, and really explore, do I feel as though I'm not, worthy to be here? Am I worried I'm not smart enough? Really dig into that and get curious about it, because the more that you understand that piece of yourself, the less you're going to start to care what people think of you. And that way you can really just walk into that board meeting, do a great job. And if they didn't like you, you can take that as a data point. It doesn't matter, personally what they think of you.
Amazing, amazing.
So
No,
that
Kyler,
would be my
that's
piece.
that's amazing. No, thank you for that. So where can people find you, Kyler? So that if the people want to follow you, connect with
Yeah.
you, what would be your just giving you a chance to kind of like share how you want to be connected with people.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can find me on LinkedIn at Kyler Cheatham. You can also find me on TikTok, which we've built kind of a little community there at Kyler Cheatham. Again, you can visit our website at theconfluential.com to see kind of our services. And you can also follow our Bite Size podcast that we have each week in our mini episodes, which are always fun to kind of engage with. And of course, my DMs are always open, no matter on what platform you have. I spend my time creating that content because I want to make it as valuable and accessible for the audience in general. And so I always love to hear feedback or love to collaborate with people, which is how we met. So
Yeah,
I'm
exactly.
very, very open to doing those types of things. But I appreciate you having this conversation with me today. It's been so fun.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for making the time for me. Like I know that there's this random guy who reached out to you saying, "Hey,
No,
can we
I love that.
but when I saw your stuff, I was like, I do want to talk with you, and I wanted to have you on the podcast for this very reason, because
Mhm.
you have such great knowledge to share, and I think this is a great way to just help educate everybody, and have them just think a little bit differently at the end of the day, right? About these
Absolutely.
topics. So
Yeah.
thank you so much for that, Kyler. I really appreciate that.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And I'm excited to continue to connect with everyone.
Fantastic. Well, listen, we're going to be back in a couple of weeks. I haven't yet announced who's my next guest. I'm just figuring out a few little, last minute things. But I have two more sessions left for the year for this podcast, and then we're going to call it a wrap for season three. So I can't believe I'm done with season three almost. So, well, thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of the day, and have a great weekend. Talk to you guys soon.
Bye.